Okay, well, it's 11:01 my time, and I know we are up against lunch, and we have a lot of ground to cover because it was a very, very busy year in weather and climate here in North Carolina. So my name is Dr. Kathy Dello. I'm the director of the North Carolina State Climate Office, and I am also the state climatologist of North Carolina. And I get the honor of introducing Corey Davis. He's our assistant state climatologist and really, truly our weather and climate guru. He writes our monthly blog. He's who I go to anytime I have some sort of data question. It's all in his head. He knows North Carolina inside and out. So you'll be hearing mostly from him today. I will talk a little bit at the end, but we'll cover about 40 minutes of material and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. And we share space with the National Weather Service, and I see their snowboard outside, so I know we're anticipating some winter weather, and we may have some thoughts on that as well. Some general logistics, just please mute yourself and turn off video. We'll have time to chat at the end. We're going to cover a number of things that happened over the past year. I saw a lot of Helene's in the chat, but certainly it was an eventful year from January to December. Go ahead and type your questions in the chat as you think of them, and we will answer them at the end. And our new extension associate, Allison Whitaker, will be the one moderating the Q&A. And go ahead and follow along on social media. We're on a number of platforms, LinkedIn, we've got an EcoNet Instagram, we're on Blue Sky, and we're on X as well. And go ahead and use a hashtag if that suits your fancy. And next slide. And just a little bit about us in the State Climate Office. We're a public service center in the UNC system. We're housed at NC State University. I am sitting on Centennial campus right now. And we're in the College of Sciences. And essentially, we help all 11 million North Carolinians understand their climate risk. And that is in all 100 counties. And we do it through things like this. We host informal webinars. We do trainings. We do workshops. We work with K-12 students, original research on North Carolina's environment, and we're also monitoring. So we have 45 weather stations called the North Carolina EcoNet located across the state. And what we really strive to do is bridge the gap between people who are making decisions, and that's all of you. It's people who are planting their gardens, it's people who are making big decisions about rebuilding roads, and the science that we have here at NC State University. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey.
All right, thanks, Kathy. I appreciate the introduction. I'll extend that welcome to everybody. This is always one of my favorite events of the year as we get to basically tell the story of the past year in North Carolina's weather and climate. And again, 2024 was a very interesting, a very impactful year. So we'll get straight into this with some of the overall numbers and rankings from the past year. For starters, let's talk about our temperatures. So this is a big one. 2024 was the second warmest year on record for North Carolina. If you're not familiar with where this number comes from, as a quick overview, this data comes from the National Centers for Environmental Information. They're based out in Asheville, but they process data from all across the country. They take weather station observations that come in from around the country. They interpolate those to a grid so that every point has equal representation. And they've done that with data going back to 1895. So essentially, when we're comparing 2024 to things that happened 100 years ago, that's an apples to apples comparison. And again, that tells us that 2024 was the second warmest year on record, behind only 2019, which, as you'll see in a minute, was just fractionally warmer than last year. We were about 2.5 degrees above the recent 30-year average. And again, that's consistent with something that we've seen in several recent years across North Carolina. I think it's also useful to look and see how that warmth was distributed throughout the year. I know sometimes we tend to judge a year based on how hot the summer was. Certainly, we had some heat, especially early in the summer last year. But when we look at a graph like this that shows the monthly temperature departures from this long-term average, what we see is that it was actually the spring and the fall where we saw that most prominent warmth, again, compared to that historical average. We warmed up very early coming out of the winter. By February, March last year, we were already seeing those spring-like temperatures and really did not have much in the way of a late spring frost or freeze. Again, that warmth lasted on through the spring into the summer. We know we had some of those 100-degree days in June and early July. When we started getting some more of that rain in August and September, we weren't quite as warm, but the warmth definitely picked back up by the fall. In November, it took almost all month for some areas to get their first freeze of the season, and that month definitely stood out. It was our third warmest November on record. One other thing that may stand out on this graph is that all 12 months last year were warmer than the long-term average. And that's only the third time that's happened in North Carolina. The others were in 1998 and in 2017. So when we think about the second warmest year on record, one of the big standout things is that it was just lasting, persistent warmth all year long. Here's a look at a map across the state that shows some of those local rankings. The background map here also comes from NCEI. Again, this is based on their data set where they're calculating those numbers for every point, including every county. All these bright red counties had their record warmest year in 2024, and some of the local stations, including Asheville and Hickory and Raleigh, had their warmest year on record. Charlotte tied for its warmest year on record, and pretty much everywhere else was somewhere in the top 5 or top 6 warmest on record. So what we've already seen is that there was really nowhere in the state and not many times of the year that you could go to escape that persistent warmth last year. We can also look at our precipitation. If you remember some of those big events, I know a lot of folks remembered Helene. There was also Tropical Storm Debbie and potential Tropical Cyclone 8 that you see some of the flooding from in the picture here. If you just remember those events, it probably makes sense that 2024 was a wet year. It ranks as the 31st wettest year on record, dating back to 1895, and again was about 3.5 inches above that recent 30-year average. What may be a little more surprising about that is that there were also several pretty prominent droughts last year that we'll talk about in a few slides. So when you consider that those were pretty severe droughts at times, they were more than offset by some of those wet events in order to make that one of our wetter years, at least in the recent past. Previous to 2024, we had been coming off 3 drier than normal years. So this was the first time we had been wetter since 2020. Again, we can also look at how that precipitation fell throughout the year. What really stands out, especially about the first 6 months of the year on this graph, is that we were just back and forth. We would have one wet month, one dry month, again, just alternating back and forth between wet and dry. One really kind of critical impact of that is that we pretty much hovered right around our normal precipitation on through the end of May, but we really never built up a buffer to get into a drier time. And that's exactly what happened in June. We got into a very hot and dry spell. We burned through any of those moisture reserves really quickly, and that's part of the reason why we saw that drought emerge so quickly by mid to late June. After that, we flip-flopped again. We went back to the wet side for July and August, and especially September with several of those storm events. And again, as quickly as we got wet, we went back to the dry side for October, and then we stayed dry through the end of the year. So that really stands out with our precipitation, just a lot of that back and forth. And again, we'll talk later about some examples of that and what that means in terms of our current and future climate. We can also see across the state what those precipitation rankings looked like, especially further west, those areas that had the heaviest rain from Hurricane Helene. Those sites generally finished as a little bit wetter. You'll see here Asheville had its 3rd wettest year on record. And that departure from normal, almost 16, 17 inches above normal, is pretty much solely thanks to the rain from Helene back in late September. We also saw a similar departure in Marion, which had its 7th wettest year on record. Across the Piedmont, of course, we didn't see that heavy rain from Helene, but it was still a pretty wet year in places like Greensboro and Raleigh and Charlotte. And then once we get into eastern North Carolina, especially some of the places that really didn't see as much rain from Helene and really not much rain in the second half of the hurricane season, they actually finished a little bit drier than normal for the year. So you can see a number of the sites that were a little bit below normal, especially up in the northeastern corner of the state, places like Edenton that were almost 5 inches below normal for the year and finished with some drought on the map in 2024. So if you've joined our year in review webinars in the past, you'll know at this point I usually switch gears and go through each season, talk about some of the big weather events and weather patterns. But I'm changing that a little bit this year. Instead of talking about each season, I wanted to talk about 4 major weather stories in 2024 because these kind of infiltrated each season throughout the year, as we'll see. The first one we'll talk about is the prevailing warmth. We already looked at those annual rankings, the second warmest year on record. We look at those monthly departures where all 12 months were warmer than normal. But we can also see some other examples of how warm it was last year. First off, I pulled the top 15 warmest years on record in North Carolina based on NCEI's data. You can see 2024 right near the top, again, just a fraction of a degree behind 2019, which is still the warmest year on record. But beyond that, we have 11 of the top 15 warmest years on record have all happened since 2007. So that represents a lot of warmth happening very recently within the last 20 years. And you can see basically the same thing on the graph on the right here. If you sort of squint your eyes, you can definitely detect a warming trend since the mid to late 1960s. Another way that I like to look at this graph is just say, take any of these years in the past decade, superimpose them on any of those years back in the 20th century, and you can see how out of place that warmth would have been historically. But instead of out of place, it's just commonplace now. Again, especially over that last 10 years or so, we are consistently seeing these average temperatures that are running 2, 3 degrees above that historical average. We also saw those signs of warmth locally all throughout the year, and it was not just with those hot summer days. Again, this is something that we saw in all seasons, so I wanted to highlight a few examples of that. First off, we go back to the winter. We'll go to Asheville in February. This is the time of the year where they're used to falling below freezing every night, where they can still have some snow on the ground, and where it still feels very much like winter in February, or at least that's what they expect. That's not what they got last year. February the 10th, they had a high temperature of 72 degrees. That's more like what they expect in the middle of April than the middle of February there. We go to the next month in March. Out in parts of eastern North Carolina, places like Wilson went the entire month of March without having any freezing temperatures. And that was the first time that they had gone an entire March without getting below freezing since 1945. Right after that in April, we also had some really unseasonable warmth. We had a daily record high low temperature, so your morning low is as warm as it's ever been for that day. 66 degrees, that's pretty close to what their average high is for that day of the year, just to give you a sense of how out of place that warmth was. And then later that afternoon, it made it up to 88 degrees in Goldsboro. Again, that's summer-like temperatures that were happening pretty early in the spring there. We come into the summer, and of course, there's plenty of examples we could show here of some of those record warm high temperatures that we had in parts of the state. But I wanted to highlight one of those record warm nighttime lows. So on June 23rd in Greensboro, it never dropped below 74 degrees. And again, I know those record highs tend to get a lot of attention, but these record lows are important as well because whether you're talking about people or plants or animals, we all rely on those nighttime temperatures cooling off to give us a chance to rest and recover. And when it never drops below 74 degrees, you're not going to do a whole lot of recovery. So that was an important sign that we were seeing in 2024 of that warmth. We come into the fall now, go out again to western North Carolina. Oconaluftee had their latest 80-degree day on record on November 9th. Again, this is the sort of temperature they would expect in August or September, not in the second week of November. And then in Raleigh, we didn't see the first freeze of the season until the very end of November. That wrapped up a record-long freeze-free season that started back in February. 281 days last year in Raleigh between the last spring freeze and the first fall freeze. So again, all these just signs that we were seeing in all seasons of the warmth last year. Another big weather story in 2024 was multiple drought events, and I'll start out talking about one that's maybe not a traditional drought in terms of precipitation, but one that I know has been in a lot of folks' minds, especially with the forecast over the last couple of weeks, which is the snow droughts that we've been in across the state. This map shows the total snowfall from last winter, ending last March. You can see really the only snow we saw was in some of the higher elevation places in western North Carolina. Even out in the Asheville area, they had little to no snow last winter. And across pretty much the entire Piedmont and coastal plain, basically no snow at all, really no flakes to speak of over the past winters. So some of these areas were going into this winter with more than 1,000 days, almost 3 years in a row without seeing any measurable snow. We know that has changed in some spots, but I'll highlight some of those long snow droughts that we have seen. First off, there's a handful of sites in the western and northwestern part of the state that saw some of those long snow droughts end back in December. There was some light snow the first week of the month, and that ended Asheville's longest snow drought on record and the second longest for Statesville and Greensboro. We come into 2025 now. As we know, about a week ago, we had some snow, and that ended the longest snow drought for Marion and Charlotte. Charlotte didn't see a lot of snow there. It was only about half an inch, but again, it was measurable snow, so it was enough to end that 1,076-day record snow drought. And then Raleigh also had its second longest snow drought on record that finally came to an end. I will also highlight here a few spots in eastern North Carolina that did not see snow earlier this month, but based on some of the forecasts for later this afternoon and tonight, they do have, it looks like, a pretty decent shot of seeing some snow. So for Elizabeth City, if you got your fingers crossed, you may see your second longest snow drought on record finally come to an end after almost 1,100 days. Same story down for Washington and Wilmington, where they haven't seen snow in almost 3 years now. If we switch now to more of that traditional drought, just not getting enough rainfall and the impacts that are associated with that, I really like this sort of chart because it shows throughout the year from January to December the percentage of the state that was in each U.S. drought monitor category. This drought graph tells an interesting story. We just heard earlier that it was overall a wetter than normal year for North Carolina, but we look at this graph and see that at least some part of the state was dealing with abnormally dry conditions or some level of drought for pretty much the entire year. So that was just the story of 2024. We had drought and we had those heavy rain events that were coexisting and that were happening pretty much back to back. On this graph, we can pick out some of the more notable dry periods and droughts. One of those happened in the spring. Again, April was drier than normal, so we started seeing about half of the state in abnormally dry conditions by the end of the month. The big one, of course, was in the summer. Mid to late June and early July, we saw those drought conditions just explode across the state. And pretty much as soon as they showed up, they disappeared because we got into that wetter pattern in July and August and saw that rapid improvement. But as we'll see in a minute, the damage was already done, especially to a lot of the crops by then. We saw some drought creeping into western North Carolina by the fall. Of course, Helene put a very quick end to that. But then on the other side of the state in the east, where they didn't get as much rain, they started getting back into those dry times by October and November. And even in western North Carolina, they were just 2 months off of the flooding from Helene, and they were getting back into drought by later on in the fall. I just wanted to highlight that summer drought. We sometimes talk about these fast emerging droughts as flash droughts, but the one we saw last summer was like really nothing we've ever seen before. For myself and a lot of the folks that serve on North Carolina's Drought Council, at the time I remember talking about just how unprecedented it was to see these degradations like that, where on the drought map we were seeing entire category degradations from one week to the next. And you can see here in the middle of June, we were generally in pretty good shape. Again, it had been a wet May, so we didn't have a lot of problems coming out of the spring. And then all it took was a few weeks of that hot and dry weather to get most of the state in drought conditions with pockets of severe and even extreme drought by early July. We'll talk about some of the drought impacts that we observed last year. Again, agriculture is one big one that we usually talk about, especially with a summer drought, and that was no exception last year. And unfortunately, it was really bad timing for the corn crop. The month of June is usually when the corn is going through its silking phase. That's when it needs a lot of moisture so those silks can be pollinated. And if they don't get that moisture, and if it's hot at the same time, then they can really just fry up those corn crops on the stalks, and they may never recover. And that's what we saw last year. I've seen estimates that 60% of the corn production was lost last year because of that summer drought. We also saw places in eastern North Carolina start to implement water restrictions and conservation measures, and that was not necessarily because they were running low on water at the time, but for a lot of those coastal towns and communities that don't have access to large reservoirs, with that hot, dry spell hitting pretty early in the season, they wanted to make sure they could hold on to whatever water they needed just in case that drought lasted throughout the rest of the season or even the rest of the year. And again, fortunately, we did see some rain in those areas by July and August that helped ease some of those concerns. Also last year, we did have some wildfire activity, especially in the summer and fall. And again, that included parts of western North Carolina that were just a few weeks past Hurricane Helene. They had just seen flooding across the landscape, and then because it dried out so quickly, they started seeing wildfire concerns. The photo here is from McDowell County in early December, where they were still seeing 500-acre fires that late into the season, just with as dry as it had been. This data is courtesy of North Carolina Forest Service. I will note that the 2024 numbers are preliminary. They're still getting and crunching their final numbers for last year. But based on the state and private lands where they track wildfires, they had counted 4,680 fires for the year that burned a total of 17,220 acres. You can see based on this graph that goes back about 10 years, both of those numbers are kind of in the middle of the road, so about average for what we've seen in our recent past. And certainly the amount of acreage burned was well down from what we saw in 2023 when we had a more severe fall drought and a lot more active fall fire seasons. So we talk a lot about the extremes from 2024. Fortunately, wildfires is one area that was not as extreme. And a big reason for that is just because we had enough rain in the spring during that typical fire season to hold down the activity at that time of the year. So we've just talked about drought and some events impacts. We can also talk about the opposite side of the precipitation spectrum with heavy rain and storms. There's examples that we could point out here really all throughout the year, but I wanted to focus on just the 2 months in late summer and early fall when we had some of the heaviest rain and some of the biggest impacts. We'll start with Tropical Storm Debbie in August. This was a very slow moving storm. It just crept up the coast of South Carolina, finally made its way into North Carolina, but over 3 or 4 days, it dropped really heavy rainfall, more than 8 inches in parts of southeastern North Carolina. And then as it finally turned inland and again made a very slow crawl up across North Carolina, it brought some pretty heavy rain far west as well. So that's why when we look at the impacts from Debbie, we see there was flooding in places like Charlotte along the greenways. And then out in Fayetteville, some of their dams had been breached or failed just because so much water was trying to flow through there over that 3 or 4 days that the rain was falling. Then we go to the middle of September. That was our next big rain event. This was potential tropical cyclone 8. It was never a named tropical storm. It was just an offshore low pressure system that in some ways was similar to Debbie. It just sat there and spun and spun and spun for several days. And you can see pretty much all the state got at least some rain from that system, but especially down in the far southeastern corner, the Wilmington area down to around Southport and Bald Head Island, they had the heaviest rainfall, more than 18 inches in some areas. And we can see the impacts from that as well. A lot of that rain fell just on a single day. It was on a Monday, I believe. So in Carolina Beach, they sent their kids to school that morning, not expecting any more than just a little bit of rain. By that afternoon, they were having to call out the high water vehicles to get those kids home and to rescue folks whose houses were being inundated by the flooding. And again, in the Southport area, that much rain falling over such a short time period caused a lot of flooding issues. It caused some roads, like you see here, to be washed out as well. So this was sort of that storm sandwiched in the middle of our summer, but in that local part of the state, it certainly caused some pretty big damage as well. And of course, we can't talk about 2024 without talking about Helene and all the damage that it caused. Helene stands as the costliest and the deadliest hurricane in North Carolina's history. And when we look at this map of the precipitation, this is what fell from Helene as well as from that slow-moving frontal event in the days just before the storm. But these totals in western North Carolina, just unheard of. More than 12 inches from Brevard all the way up to Boone, a pretty wide pocket just east of Asheville that had more than 18 inches, and locally upwards of 30 inches of rain in some parts of western North Carolina. Obviously, the flooding was the big story from Helene. I know folks have seen and heard a lot about this, but just wanted to show a couple of the photos that really stood out the most to me from that event. One of those was in Marshall. This is just downstream of Asheville along the French Broad River. We know how much rain fell in Asheville and what the flooding problems were there. Well, that wall of water just worked its way downstream and also flooded towns like Marshall. And then similarly out in Chimney Rock, this is a small town that sits right along a river between two mountains. There's just nowhere for that much water to go. So we saw in Chimney Rock that widespread damage and pretty much all of downtown, including the roads that run through it, were just wiped out by that storm. Another part of Helene that maybe hasn't gotten quite as much attention as the rain was the wind. Here's a map of the wind gusts from Helene all across the state. You can see as far east as Wilmington, we were seeing tropical storm force gusts. That speaks to how big of a storm and how wide the circulation was around Helene. But it was especially in the mountains where the eye of that storm tracked a little bit closer, where we saw those strongest gusts. Our Econet station out on Frying Pan Mountain recorded a new record wind gust, 87 miles per hour. And our station up on Mount Mitchell had a gust of 106 miles per hour. So probably not too surprising when you see gusts that strong. There was quite a bit of wind damage in these areas in western North Carolina. In the weeks after that storm, we were hearing reports that people said it looked like a tornado came through. In talking from folks with the Weather Service down in Greenville, Spartanburg, they said there was no evidence of a tornado, at least in those areas. It was basically the remnant eye wall of what was not long before a Category 4 hurricane that just collapsed over those mountain areas. And they did an analysis of some of those strongest gusts, especially to the northeast of Asheville. They saw a pretty wide area that had hurricane force wind gusts. In some areas, these gusts lasted for 3, 4, 5 hours on the morning that Helene's eye rolled through. So the result was just like you see on the picture on the left here, entire mountainsides where the trees were all blown over. Really just unbelievable damage in addition to what they had seen from the flooding out there. And another impact from Helene was tornado activity. I've color-coded the tornadoes last year based on the events. Any of the ones with the sort of burgundy background occurred during Helene. You can also see some from Debbie back in August across eastern North Carolina. In total, there were 42 confirmed tornadoes across the state last year. That's the most in a year since 2020. And one really notable thing about this tornado activity is how many of them came from tropical systems. Between Helene and Debbie combined, that was 20 tornadoes. If you want to throw in that potential tropical cyclone 8, that adds another 2. So even though we did see some of that typical spring activity, including out in the mountains, a lot of those tornadoes were concentrated later in the summer and fall with our landfalling storms. And then the final thing I'll talk about here is what we call weather whiplash. This is a term that we coined at our office a few years ago, and it just describes that pattern of going back and forth from wet to dry or dry to wet with almost no warning. It's really unpredictable, and as I'll show here, it can be pretty impactful as well. I wanted to start with an example from the spring last year, and again, we saw how back and forth our month-to-month precipitation was then. Well, that created some real challenges for agriculture, especially as folks wanted to get crops planted and get going in the fields. I wanted to highlight some reports here that come from North Carolina Cooperative Extension. We review these reports on our state drought calls every week, and this helps with our drought assessments and making recommendations to the U.S. Drought Monitor. So back on March the 5th, we were coming out of that very warm into winter. Farmers would have been eager to get their crops in the ground, but at that point, they had enough rain. It was just too wet for them to get in the fields. So they were on one side of that weather whiplash where it was a little too wet. About a month later, early April, we had finally started to see things dry out a little bit, and this was one of the very few times all year where farmers had those Goldilocks conditions, where they were just right for planting. So farmers did get some of their crops started back in early April, but by the end of the month, when we got into that drier pattern, we heard across the Piedmont that some farmers had slowed down or even stopped their planting because the soils had gotten so dry, they just knew that seed would not germinate with the way things looked. So, that was 4 weeks, and we saw that quick of a turnaround. And then we went back the other way by early June. In Wake County, we had extension folks telling us that with that little bit of rain they got in the end of May, the tobacco crop was looking in better shape. I wish I could say that this was a happily ever after story, but if you remember the date here in early June, this was right before we got into that really hot and really dry pattern. Some areas went more than 3 weeks in a row without seeing a drop of rainfall. So, of course, this was one of the last good ag reports that we got for the year. A lot of troubles for the farmers after that with both the drought and then the floods that followed. Then I'll also highlight one local example of this weather whiplash that we saw this year. And I want to focus on Columbus County. As you can see on the map here, it's in the southeastern corner of the state. It's a really important region of the state for agricultural production, especially for corn. And unfortunately, this was not a great year for their corn crop. Back at the end of June, again, going through that hot and dry stretch, the corn was just not in good shape. By this time of the year, the corn would normally be at least neck high, if not head high, on this guy and fully green. But in this case, it was barely waist high and it was brown. And again, a lot of the corn in places like this just never made a recovery after that early summer drought. So that was on the dry extreme. We go less than 2 months later after Tropical Storm Debbie came through, and we were back on the wet extreme, flooding across Columbus County, including in fields like the one that we're dealing with drought just a couple months before that. So at that point, I'll hand it back over to Kathy. She'll talk about the last year in a state level and a global perspective, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, so this is the point in the talk where we zoom out a little bit and give Corey a chance to take a breather before questions. But I also just want to acknowledge that every single year when we put this presentation together, we talk about the impacts to actual people and how these events are really damaging. And I know especially this year, that's true of many of you on this call, friends, family, neighbors. So we are thinking of Western North Carolina and its long road to recovery. I also wanted to give kudos and thanks to the National Weather Service, the folks at NCEI, North Carolina Emergency Management. I scrolled the list, a lot of our state agency partners who did some amazing work in the days following both PTC8 and Helene. So we're really glad to have you as colleagues and partners and on this call. And now I will start talking about what I'm supposed to start talking about. So we live on a planet and the planet is warming, and 2024 was our warmest year on record. So it's the second warmest year in North Carolina and the warmest for the planet. And this was confirmed by independent agencies. So NASA has satellites and data, and NOAA has observations all over the world and ground that they integrate, and they come to this conclusion on their own. And there are other groups as well at Berkeley and in Europe who also confirmed that 2024 was the warmest year on record. And when you look at our last 10 years, they are the 10 warmest years on record. So we know that the planet's heating up and we're seeing some of the impacts here in North Carolina. That's not to say that winter doesn't happen. We're certainly feeling that right now. We see these cold snaps. We got some snow back, but overwhelmingly, we are seeing the fingerprints of climate change here in our state. And what was remarkable about the global heat over the past 2 years is that it really ramped up in 2023. And we had 15 consecutive months of records from June to August. And there was a point where I was getting an email every single month from a reporter saying, Kathy, we broke another global monthly temperature record. Do you have a comment? Do you have a comment? Do you have a comment? And I lost count of what was happening. So we know that not every year is going to be a record. Climate's not a stair step. And if you look at the last 10 years, it's not 2015, 2016, 2017. 2023 and 2024 were both very warm. Here in North Carolina, we've started off January cold. It's going to be one of our cooler months of the past 2 years here. But the planet is warm again, and we would expect that 2025 will fall also in the top 10 warmest years on record. Next slide. And looking at the country, the story is the same. I mean, we could have given this talk for a number of states. We wouldn't have done so well because we're not focusing on them, but warm across the US Northeast, warm across the Southeast, record warm in a number of these states in the dark red. And again, these stats are compiled by our colleagues up in Asheville at the National Centers for Environmental Information, a wealth of information on their website, which they were luckily able to get back up in quick order following Helene. So take a look if you want to explore more there. And we'll go to the next slide. And precip-wise, it was essentially a wet year for all of us. You see the impacts of the hurricanes in Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, but also with the sort of rain that we saw in both potential Tropical Cyclone 8 and Helene, we would be thinking, this would be one of our top 10 wettest years. But as Corey mentioned multiple times, we had these droughts interspersed throughout the year. So that weather whiplash helped keep us a little bit lower, but still overall a wet year in North Carolina. Wet in Louisiana and places across the US as well, and some droughts emerging in places like Montana and Wyoming. Next slide. And we just wanted to take a quick look at events with over 18 inches of rain in North Carolina, so 1.5 feet of rain. Going back to 1916, we heard a lot about the July 1916 storm that was the flood of record up in Asheville until Helene. A number of hurricanes, which some of you may remember, Dennis, Floyd, Francis. We had coastal fronts and upper level lows, and then the recent hurricanes that we've been talking quite a bit about, Matthew and Florence. And then I wish we had a snappier title for potential tropical cyclone 8, but we're still calling it potential because it never got an official name, and Helene that happened within 2 weeks in September. So certainly we are seeing these events emerge, a number of them in the past 10 years, and there will be more of these in the future. Next slide. And I just wanted to make a quick plug for our climate blog. We made it easy to subscribe with a QR code. We're publishing, and by we, I mean Corey, publishing a retrospective on the surprise January 2000 snowstorm here in Raleigh, with some interviews from folks at the National Weather Service, the city of Raleigh, and some folks who lived through it. So we're looking forward to that, but we do not spam you. We send you at least one post a month on the monthly climate in North Carolina. If there's an event like PTC8 or Helene, we send a rapid response recap after that. And then Corey does some topical posts as well. And thank you for your attention. Thank you for showing up. We breezed through that, so we have plenty of time for questions in the chat. You will get a blog on what we talked about at noon, and we will post this online if you want to look back and watch it again or send it to your colleagues. So thank you for your attention, and I'm going to turn it over to Allison to moderate the Q&A.
Thanks, Kathy and Corey. So this is your opportunity to ask questions. I haven't seen any come in the chat yet, so please take this opportunity while I quickly introduce myself. I am Allison Whitaker. I am the Extension Associate at the State Climate Office, and I'm so happy to be here with you all today. Also, think about topics that you'd like for us to discuss. We always can talk about climate and weather. So anything that comes up. Someone's noted the sunflowers at Dix Park in Raleigh having a difficult year. Corey or Kathy, did you ever get over to Dix Park and see those?
Not this year because of the hot weather that was happening that was stressing the sunflowers. So I avoided it. But yeah, the sunflowers are such a beautiful gift. And I know that the weather was tough on a number of plants. So we talked about the corn, but the sunflowers are a great example too.
So we've got a couple of questions about what to expect in the coming year, especially pointing out the La Nina forecast. Do either of you want to take that?
Yeah, this is an interesting time right now because, right in the middle of winter, this is usually when we have the strongest idea about, at least for the current season, what that El Nino or La Nina pattern will be. We are in the La Nina, but it's a fairly weak one. Usually we would expect to see warmer and drier conditions over a La Nina winter for North Carolina. Obviously, that hasn't really been the case, at least on the warm side. We've definitely been cooler over the last few weeks and seeing more snow chances than we would usually expect. But part of that is just because it's a weaker event. The influence that La Nina has on the jet streams, for instance, are a lot weaker as well. So it's kind of up to those local whims and patterns to dictate our weather instead. Looking ahead, even beyond the spring, really tough to know exactly what may happen. The spring and summer is usually when those El Nino, La Nina patterns are evolving and changing and sort of getting in place for where they're going to be the following winter. So there's very low confidence at this point about what that may look like for next winter. But again, for now, we can say it's officially the La Nina, but doesn't look like one here in North Carolina.
Sorry. Someone has asked about PCT8. How did this weather event happen with so little warning?
Yeah, this was an interesting system. It was not a tropical storm. It was basically a cold front that had moved through and then parked off the coast of the Carolinas. It was a stationary front. It wasn't moving very quickly. And because the water off our coast over the Gulf Stream is so warm, that cluster of thunderstorms that had been part of the front sort of got organized into a low pressure system, but just never quite organized enough to become a named tropical storm. And then what we saw down in places like Carolina Beach is that they were getting that southeasterly flow off the ocean, and there was a line of those showers and storms that basically just sat right over them all day for that one Monday, and then parts of other days as well. So they were kind of right in the crossfire of that moisture and that heavy rain, which is why, on the map we saw not a lot of areas getting that, 6-inch plus rain amounts, but in the areas that saw the rain, it was 18, 20 inches.
Thanks, Corey. Kathy, I'm going to give this one to you. Would you speak a little bit about the weather impacts and how they combine to impact health in the environment? For example, this person is thinking about how high heat and high levels of precipitation might impact the heat index and the wet bulb globe temperature to make heat stroke more prevalent.
Yeah, so this is something we've been thinking about a lot, how compound hazards affect essentially North Carolinians. And one of the examples, and I know she's on here and I'm not going to put her on the spot, but is the compounding of areas that see extreme heat and flooding. And we saw an example of this in New Orleans after Hurricane Ida. You had a hurricane move in, a lot of people lost power, and then a heat wave afterward. And if you start to think about the people who need air conditioning to survive, so the elderly, people who are sick, people who are in hospitals, that certainly poses challenges. But even in when we're not having blockbuster heat events, Corey mentioned the 74 degrees overnight in Greensboro. We see people have challenges because they either go to bed and expect it to cool down, or they lack access to air conditioning, or they can't afford to turn on their air conditioner, or they've been outside working all day and their body is already stressed and it just stays warm overnight. So we do think a lot about that. But then in the wet bulb globe temperature, and this is something that our office is also focusing on, it may be a better metric of physiological heat stress than the heat index. It takes into account solar radiation and wind speed. And we've seen some values that are really difficult for anyone to thrive. And so when you get a wet bulb globe temperature of over 90, you need to be taking precautions, sitting in the shade, drinking water. And I'll channel my friend and colleague, Ashley Ward, who runs the Duke University Heat Hub. You know, a lot of these interventions are low cost and easy to do. So thinking about eating dinner earlier in the evening, drinking a lot of water, soaking your feet, taking a cold shower, that can help stave off some of the most detrimental impacts. But yeah, we're always thinking about how these events and the climate and the weather interact with human health and people's just experience with the environment.
Thanks, Kathy. All right, let's move on to some questions about Helene. Someone's asked about how the drought and wet cycles, this weather whiplash that we've referred to, how will that impact the recovery from Helene? Do we expect to have more landslides, fire risk, down trees?
I'll speak to one element of that, which is the fire risk. I know talking with some folks from North Carolina Forest Service, this is going to be a problem not just next year. This could be a problem 10, 15 years down the road. We saw the picture earlier that, entire mountainside was just leveled. There's so much debris left behind from that storm in the forest and even in some of the towns that if they were to get into a drought like we've seen in some recent falls in Western North Carolina, all that's going to be ready to burn. So that is a big concern that it's going to change the way that they're managing the forested lands in those areas. And certainly I know even in the months after Helene, a lot of the homeowners there wanted to start burning some of that debris off, and the fire marshals were telling them not so fast. Even though it's been so wet from that storm, had been so dry after that there were concerns that wildfires could be set off because of that debris burning. So again, I think it's really going to change the way that the fire seasons look and work in that part of the state, probably for a decade or more. And that's something also we've seen down in places like the Gulf Coast in Alabama and Mississippi. They had Hurricane Ivan that came through there in 2005, and it had a lot of the same, especially wind impacts there, and kind of altered the way that those forests recovered and were managed after that as well.
Corey, picking up on that wildfire theme, do you know of a threshold that North Carolina would have after which we expect to see a consistent uptick in wildfires?
Do you know if this is for like a specific season or just like a, long-term?
I believe it's a long term. That's my understanding. And the person who asked this question, please feel free to clarify.
Yeah,
Oh yeah,
so
long term, just looking at trends.
Okay. Yeah, I would say again, our weather tends to be so variable in North Carolina that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see, that year-over-year increase. We can have some very wet years where we wouldn't expect to see as much in the way of wildfires, and then some years where if it dries out, especially at the right times in the spring and fall, where those can be a lot bigger issue. Within a given season, just if folks are curious, one big thing we look at is the number of days since the wetting rain, which for the Forest Service, that's about a 1/4 inch. Anything less than that, it's going to evaporate pretty quickly. It's probably not going to soak into the ground, into some of the fuels like, dead sticks and twigs and things. So last year, especially in June, we were starting to get 20, 30 days in a row without a wetting rain. We saw the same thing in some places in October, November. So that's one number to watch out for. If it's been basically a month since you had any decent rainfall, that's always going to be a potential trigger for wildfires.
And I'll just add, we know the temperatures are getting warmer. So that is one contributor. So, and our droughts are drier and we're seeing these swings between the wet and the dry. So we are seeing these exacerbated conditions as we go from year to year, which increase our wildfire risk.
Kathy, I'm gonna hand this question to you. So this question is around who we're collaborating with. It seems like people are starting to pull the threads of all the different intersections that climate has in so many different realms. So if you want to speak to maybe some federal agencies that we're working with, and also how we're working with health professionals.
Yeah, so we work with a lot of people, and I tell folks that if you were to look at my calendar, you would not know I was a climate scientist because we are meeting with agencies and school groups and engineers and mayors and town planners, and the list goes on and on. We do collaborate closely with federal agencies. NOAA is the obvious one, and I did see that in the question. We share space with the National Weather Service, and they're a good friend and partner to us, but also We work with USGS, the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center is hosted here at NC State. USDA is a close collaborator. They fund some of our work, but also through the Drought Monitor, we collaborate with them. Federal Highways, US Department of Transportation, but I would say our bread and butter is working with North Carolina state agencies. We have really close collaborations with a number of folks who I see on the list here, and hello to all of you, but North Carolina Emergency Management, Department of Environmental Quality, Transportation, Health and Human Services. Essentially, they're climate scientists, they're experts. A lot of those folks don't have that expertise on staff, and you wouldn't expect them to, but they can come to us with a problem they're facing or a question they have, and we can tailor research to them, or we can talk through outreach, or we can even just have an informal 1-hour meeting, kind of like this, of what we know about a situation and how it might address their specific needs. We also do a lot of listening to them to learn specifically about what they're managing, what's keeping them up at night, and how we could connect climate and weather to that as well. So it's a lot of give and take between both the state and federal agencies. And then I think there was something about healthcare. So we do host NOAA's Climate Adaptation Partnership, and through that, one of our colleagues, Dr. Jennifer Runkle, is an epidemiologist, and she's working closely with community health centers. And we are also working with a rural health center in northeastern North Carolina to just help disseminate information and, again, answer their questions. A lot of what we do is end user driven. I like to say that I don't walk in to the office and say, we're going to do this today, because what I think is important isn't necessarily what North Carolinians need. So we're listening to folks about, their concerns, questions, research needs, and then we tailor our work to that.
Thank you, Kathy. Corey, I'm going to put you on the spot to talk about weather whiplash. What do you see as some long-term impacts of weather whiplash for our state?
I'm going to focus more on the planning perspective, because that's the feedback I've heard from a lot of folks, especially that manage lands and have to deal with things like wildfires. When we started seeing these events, especially in the last 3, 4, 5 years, they were asking, can we predict these types of events, whether it's going into a flash drought or suddenly having a lot of rain? The answer, unfortunately, is not really. We may be able to give folks a week or two heads up that, it looks like it's going to be really hot and dry, but because these tend to be warm season type patterns, we don't have a lot of great predictability at that time of the year for those specific events. We may be able to say whether it might be warmer or cooler overall, or wetter or drier for a hurricane season, but in terms of how those events stack up back to back against each other, there's not a lot of great predictability. So again, from the planning side, that's, I think, one of the most concerning parts, is that folks can't look 3 months down the line and say, we're expecting we might have a hot, dry summer. Because you may have a hot, dry part of summer followed by a really wet, flooding part of summer. And again, I think that just speaks to the nature of these events. They are hitting us hard and fast, unpredictably, and we've seen in the last year what the impacts can be from both the dry and the wet side of that.
Thanks, Corey. It definitely came up during our session at the Extension Conference as well. People were thinking about how to be more resilient in the face of unpredictable climate. All right. There's a follow-up to the PCTA question. Just thinking about, is this a unique situation, or will we be seeing more of these in the future?
Yeah, the kind of funny thing about the way that storm emerged is that if we were to think of a cold front stalling off the coast and a low pressure forming there, and maybe even a weak tropical system forming from that, usually we would expect to see that in May or June, very early in the hurricane season, even before the official start of hurricane season. At that time of the year, the Gulf Stream off our coast is one of the few areas that's warm enough to support that tropical development. So we've seen tropical storms and subtropical storms in the past form in an environment just like that. So seeing a storm like that in the middle of September was kind of out of place. We thought it just would have been a plain old tropical storm by then. But this also speaks to just a change the Hurricane Center has made. I don't think they've officially been classifying storms as potential tropical cyclone for all that many years. So the terminology is kind of new. The environmental setup behind it is something that we've seen quite a bit, but again, usually at a different time of the year.
you, Corey. All right, Kathy, I've got one for you. This is in regards to the withdrawal of the U.S. withdrawal of the Paris Climate Accord. This person is wondering if this will change any of the data collection or other work of our organization.
No, so we are an office that's been around for 48 years, and our mission has been the same ever since the beginning, which is to support North Carolina in understanding its weather and climate risk. And our roots are in agriculture, and we still do a lot of work in that, but it's expanded to meet those other agencies that I'm talking about. And we're not necessarily tied to international treaties or thinking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're really focused on the impacts here in our office and still committed to that mission that was developed 48 years ago.
Thank you. I believe we've gotten to the questions. There is one regarding federal collaboration. Kathy, are you going to be the connection for that?
I think we might have to wait and see who becomes the contacts in federal agencies as they undergo a transition. There are also a number of really accessible web pages out there for federal climate initiatives. I'm thinking of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, the USDA Climate Hub, and also the National Climate Assessment. The 5th National Climate Assessment came out in late 2023. Still the report of record. I was an author on it. I would explore those, and there are usually contacts there.
Thanks. And we do have a question. I think we have some media folks on the call. Just confirming that quotes from this webinar can be used on the record.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. We have a question, Corey. I'm going to hand this one to you. Can you speak to any unique impacts or challenges in the Sandhills region faced in 2024, or that area might be expecting in the future, particularly drought with our sandy soils?
Yeah, there's a few that we can point to, and it's again kind of on both sides of that precipitation spectrum. One of those, if I go back, a few years before 2024, back to after Hurricane Florence hit, the Sandhills is unique as a region. It has a lot of these small isolated wetland areas. After that really heavy rain from a storm like Florence, instead of seeing that normal seasonal cycle of water coming into and out of those wetlands, they were just staying filled with water all year round. That was changing things like how some of the animals and amphibians were breeding in those small wetlands and ponds. And that's something that as we start to see more and more of these really heavy rain events, where you're getting a lot of rain in a short time period, that's going to affect habitats and things like wetland areas. Drought obviously is the other side of that. And I'm thinking especially about wildfires. This is a part of the state where anytime it seems like in the spring or summer or fall, where we start to get into a few dry weeks, that's one of the first hot spots where we start to see some of that fire activity pick up. Those wiregrass ecosystems, they do not hold on to much moisture, and they can dry out pretty quickly. So, looking to the future, I think expect to see both of those. You can expect to see habitats that may be altered for seasons at a time because of heavy rainfall, and expect to see that fire regime changing and certainly shifting earlier. We may start to see fires happening even in January, but definitely by February in the Sandhills areas, possibly lasting later in the season, on into December, because we're seeing those shoulder seasons, the spring and fall, encroaching on our winters even more. Climatologically, those are some of the warmest parts of the state as is, so it doesn't take as much of a shift to put them into downright spring-like weather in the wintertime.
Thanks, Corey. And the Sandhills has a really unique biome with some plants that kind of are special to North Carolina, right? With our Venus flytraps and those sorts of plants. There's a question about weather whiplash and how it impacts North Carolina biodiversity specifically, or the spread of invasive species. And we're thinking maybe you can focus on Western North Carolina and the coastal plains as well. Kathy or Corey, I don't know which one of you would be the right fit for this question.
I've given a few talks about this before, especially with folks that, are like part of naturalist societies that are looking at, their local ecosystems. And when I talk about invasives, one of the big takeaways is that a lot of the invasives that we see coming into North Carolina are not just better adapted to a warmer climate, they're better adapted to a more variable climate. So they can handle those pretty quick shifts from wet to dry a lot better than some of the native species are. So yeah, that would be my quick main takeaway, is just we might see more of that in the future because warming or not, these new species coming in are just going to be better adapted to whatever Mother Nature brings.
All right. Well, I see the questions have slowed down in the chat. We'll give you another few seconds to put those final questions in. But it sounds like most of you have the big questions on your mind answered.
Allison, I'll ask myself one because I'm surprised this didn't come up. Corey,
Sure.
what do you think about this snow event at the coast tonight? Well, I'm glad you asked, Corey. So I'll give you a few main things to watch for as this event plays out. First off, this is kind of unusual. It's different than a lot of our snow events because the temperatures are not going to be the problem. It is plenty cold enough, as folks know if they've been outside in the last couple days, all the way to the coastline for precipitation to fall as snow. I think there may be a few areas that could mix in with a little bit of sleet, but it's one of those rare events where we've got such a deep layer of cold air this far south and east that that precipitation should fall as snow. I'll give you an area to watch for in this event as well, because I'll be watching as the reports come in there. It's Brunswick County and eastern Columbus County. We saw on the map where that is a little earlier. This is a part of the state that has not seen at least an inch of snow on the ground since January of 2011. They've been waiting 14 years for at least a little bit of snow there. So I hope the forecasts pan out. I hope they get that inch. We've got maps on our website that show the last time it snowed an inch or 6 inches or 12 inches. And I can't wait to update that map and finally erase that corner of the state that has not seen snow in that long. So I'm pulling for them. I hope they get some tonight.
All right, folks, you heard it here first. Thanks, Corey, and thank you, Kathy. We have reached our time, and so I want to wrap up today's webinar by inviting you all to keep the lines of communication open. We love hearing from you. Please reach out. And on behalf of the State Climate Office of North Carolina, I want to thank you for attending today's webinar or watching the recording. Take care, everyone.